am wondering if the mics are on, but they seem to be. So I think we're all set. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's wonderful to see this wonderful CCG community of all these wonderful ladies and gentlemen and our friends from beyond the binary who've joined us this evening. For me, it's really coming a full circle. Chinmayi was a very young professor at NUJS when I was a relatively senior student at NUJS, and I've known her for the last 15 years. So I at that point when I got to know her, I never knew that I would follow in her footsteps and do the job that she started off with. But it's this really conversation is not going to be about social media regulation or data protection or AI governance, even though I know we all work on these issues. It's really taking a moment to reflect on the tech policy journey we've had in India over the last decade and what organizations like CCG have been able to bring to this conversation, to this ecosystem. So thanks so much for coming all the way to Mumbai and joining us here today.
It's a privilege and such a pleasure. If you can't hear me, by the way, that happens. But it's so special to be able to do this. Tell me first, that we can tell us.
Great.
Well, to repeat, a privilege, but also a great pleasure. Thank you for putting this event together. It's wonderful not only to sit with Jhalak, who I met when she was a young law student, and apparently I was a very young professor, which I was, but also to have had conversations with her when she was thinking through tech policy, when she was at Harvard Law School, and also looking after my plants because we were friends by then. And then eventually it was a privilege also to discuss what a wonderful lady she would be for CCG when the Vice Chancellor was kind enough to ask what I think, which he didn't even do. And I was like, oh, you would be so lucky to have her. So we are also at this institution because you helped it survive and grow, and thank you.
Well, you're very kind, but I think I'll sort of not do a general introduction of you, but maybe through the first question I have, let you chart your journey into the tech policy sector. So when did you first start calling yourself a researcher, and what drew you to this space?
I think always, because the thing that I love the most is reading. And when I'm curious about something, I will go into a rabbit hole about it, sometimes casually, but also professionally. So even when I was doing my time in the commercial world at Ernst & Young and at the law firm, I used to choose to take on advisory work. Sometimes I would help other people with advisory questions that were not technically mine, just because it was fun. And I would invest a lot of time in understanding this thing and answering the question. I just always got a lot of joy from it. And there was a point at which I was, especially after my LLM, after I spent some time at the London School of Economics and seeing that people do this professionally, that you can get paid to spend all this time reading and thinking through questions. So I came back and I was like, maybe, I thought maybe I should do this. And that's kind of where it started. And of course, hopefully we'll talk a little more about this. You decide that, oh, wouldn't it be great to do research permanently? And obviously it's not as easy as that. Investing in research, learning, growing, dealing with all of the risks and doubts that come your way, that's 15 years of work. But I think that I always thought of myself as a researcher, and I'm very glad that I embraced it. Every time I chose it, and believe me, every 2 or 3 years, I have to choose it actively. I have always been glad I did.
Well, that's nice, because I know there are many moments when I question, is it still valuable to be in this space? Am I bringing impact? Is the work I'm doing meaningful? And I resonate with what you're saying, that it's an active choice to stay in this space. It's an active choice to give up other things and opportunities. But at the end of the day, you have to be happy with what you're doing and pleased to go to work every day and be energized about it.
And maybe you don't see the impact immediately, right? That's the other thing. Because I went through a phase where I was basically walking around Yale asking all the professors, well, how do I know what will have more impact? Because I had a few choices in front of me. The others were very obviously kind of more immediately impactful. And they were like, well, you never know what effect you'll have on the world. And so the question is, are you enjoying what you're doing? Do you think it's meaningful?
Yeah.
Right? The answer is so far been yes.
So, you were at LSE and you're like, I enjoy reading. I want to find a job that allows me to do this. So what happened next? How did CCG happen?
So next I became an academic because I thought that is a good way to start a PhD. So I was like, maybe I should do this for a few years, see what it's like, but also, I also was always interested in technology law, so specifically these questions that I was researching, because they were there, were almost always technology questions. They were about cryobanks and telecom and privacy. And so I started teaching and we ran into each other while I was. But I found, and so this is the thing also about being a researcher, which I'm sure you found, that you imagine it's one way and you start and you discover that actually no, it's not that you just decide you're going to become a researcher and everyone gives you the funding and the space to do what you want, right? It's a journey. And so I started teaching and I realized that if I want to focus on technology law, there's, in part, I'm going to need to find an institution in which it is possible to do this. And such an institution doesn't currently exist in India. But also, with technology, the thing is that technology moves so fast that if you want to research it, you not only need to be connected with the theory and the academic community, but you also need to find ways to know what's happening with the technology and how it's sort of hitting society. And again, for that, that's not the easiest thing to do in like standard Indian law school teaching as it was then. And so I said, okay, maybe there should be a research center that does this. And I actually just wanted to work for the research center, but since there wasn't one, I used to tell people that maybe after the PhD, I'll set up a research center like this. And after 2 years in Calcutta, I was moving to NLU Delhi, and I negotiated a deal with Professor Ranbir Singh, who's amazing and so wonderful in his ability to imagine new things. So if you tell him you want to try a new thing, he's like, tell me why it's interesting. And if he thinks it is, like with me, I was a little scared because he was my vice chancellor when I was a student, and so he said, I have only one thing to say to you. I said, what? He said, do not forget mobile. In this country, it's very important. And so I was supposed to go to NLU Delhi, and I had said that I will not negotiate up my salary. And this is the other thing that people don't tell you about being a researcher. You have to sacrifice sometimes for independence. And so I was like, if I can't arrive as junior faculty and just say I don't want to teach core courses because I want more time to research. So I said, okay, I have a CIS fellowship. Center for Internet Society India was kind enough to give me resources. So I was like, there's a collaboration there, but it also means that you don't have to pay me very much. And hopefully we produce interesting research that works for everyone. And we were offered seed funding at the time to set up a research center. And honestly, my first reaction was, look, I'm 27. I haven't done a PhD. Should I really be doing this? And all my friends and mentors said, you've been saying for a while that this is something that you want to see in the world. It's not going to come at the time and place of your choosing. It's come now, and so take it. And work out how to do this. If you don't know, you'll learn. Again, easier said than done, but it was fun learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think life teaches you that you plan things a certain way, but, things happen a completely different way, and it's about grabbing opportunities that come and really leveraging them in that moment in time and nurturing them to create the kind of space that you think is useful.
Yeah, and it's both a risk and a reward, right? So, of course, the PhD got pushed to 2019, which is a long time. And I didn't know whether it would work, right? But you try, and I think that the fun is in trying. It can be very stressful also, but it's so worth it because you grow, you learn new things in the process of trying, you make mistakes, everyone does. And then, surprising things happen also that you didn't see coming, which I'm sure happened to you.
Yeah, all the time. The fun is there, but there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of mistakes. So you're 27, and a big funder comes to you and says, we want to give you seed money. Why do you think they were willing to invest in an academic research center in India?
Because that's what was missing. So at the time, I mean, it may be hard to imagine now because there's so many tech policy organizations, so many people interested in privacy, but back then, there was Center for Internet and Society Bangalore. There was Anya Kovac's Internet Democracy Project, which unfortunately isn't around anymore. There was Software Freedom Law Center, Rishi Chaudhary, and there was Anita Gurumurthy's ID for Change. Most of those were advocacy organizations. And so every time a complicated legal question to do with tech came up, you had the legal professionals that were kind of doing their best to process it and write about it on the side. And then you had the advocates that were, the cycle of advocacy is different. What you're incentivized to do, the amount of time you're given to do it is completely different. And then you don't have access to library resources, students, colleagues to brainstorm things with. And so what I was doing as a young person who really never expected the seed funding was walking around saying, don't you think there should be a research center so that we can all spend time thinking this through and discussing it with, and convening people who are doing parts of it but don't have time to think this through. And clearly it resonated with enough people that one person said, take the funding. The university said, yes, take it. This is great. And our mentors like Center for Internet and Society Bangalore said, yes, take it. Start something because this needs to exist. And I think that there was a generosity not only in terms of support, financial, but also a lot of people who mentored me and us in then building the institution because we needed an institution to do this. And I can give you examples. Intermediary liability happened just a couple of years later. And we'd been researching it, we'd been doing internal reports and writing, we'd been working with the Berkman Klein Center on it. And so we had ways of thinking through why Indian law and the Indian legal system was struggling with what was effectively gatekeeper liability. And that concept didn't really exist within our legal order the way it did in other places. Net neutrality, I'll tell you a little more about later, but net neutrality, again, we had a take on it that I don't think could have come from a different institution. And so I think that's why everyone felt that it might be helpful for an institution like this to exist. And I'm grateful that they did, and I'm grateful that they believed in it.
I think it's what I find really great about the tech policy sector is how supportive people are of each other. And for your mentors to be like, yes, set up this institution, to have that approach of we want many flowers to bloom, because the more flowers we have, the more robust the space is, the better the debate is, the better the outcomes are. And I see that in peers all the time coming forward to help connect me, create pathways forward, even though in many ways we're competing organizations, but I don't look at it that way. I think we're all peer organizations working towards the same goal. Maybe there's nuance in the way we approach these issues and argue about these issues, but I think it's a largely very supportive community, and I think that's been incredible, and I think CCG has also played an important part in building such a community.
It's both. I mean, I think that the community spent effort in building us also. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. I think that the key to community is that you're supportive of each other even when you don't agree, right? So I remember when the Shreya single judgment came out, most of the Indian civil society people and academics, we were all at RightsCon. For many of us, it was our first one. We were in Manila. The judgment came out. And we were all locked in this hotel room, having this, on one hand, we were so happy and celebrating, and on the other hand, we were having this hilarious argument about what it means, and how each of us was reading it. And that's kind of the beauty of the Indian nonprofit space, that it grows, that we all have our roles, but I think that nurture is important to also help each other keep going, because it's difficult, and sometimes, in some ways, a little more difficult than in others. So that's a part of it.
And what to you stands out from that time in that room at RightsCon talking about Shreya Singhal?
So, I mean, one was that literally, so it's a global conference, right? And so our joy was so palpable that everyone knew that something had happened in India, and they were curious. Excuse me, and then there was a whole session devoted to it, and it was just the euphoria of it was so special. And then we were all in this room arguing about what it means. And then we all went off and wrote our own op-eds, each of us, about what we thought it means. And that is how it should be. Right? Are you asking me what I thought it means, or just like the ecosystem approach?
Whatever you want it to be.
Okay, so and this is a luxury of academia. So I think that if you're an advocate, a win has to be a win because there's a certain cycle that you go through. If you're an academic, and this can be very irritating for everyone else, but I think there are enough of you in the room that you understand, you're going to be like, well, what can we learn from this, right? So of course I read Shreya Singhal and I said, okay, yeah, the 66 A parts are great, but oh my god, the blocking rules. Why is there no transparency? And everyone was like, really, you read the judgment and you find the one negative thing in it. I was like, well, somebody has to. It's going to affect us later.
Well, it's still affecting us today.
Just saying.
So, so back then, what was like the state of legal scholarship on these issues? You sort of alluded to it. You've talked about the fact that there were a lot of professionals who were just carving out time to write about these issues. And how do you think, like, what value or shift did CCG bring in over that?
Well, one is, I think what we were responding to then was a particular generation of problems. I think back then, many of them were created by what we call big tech now, which is global companies. And at the time, the global companies were beginning to change how the policy space in India work. They have kind of a more ecosystem-based approach of influencing discourse. And so, on one hand, it was nice to be a part of it and learn, but on the other hand, you also had to notice that narrative building happens a particular way. As independent academics, you had to ask yourself, do you feel that all of this is okay? What parts do you agree with? What parts do you don't? And I think that what's changed now is that we also have Indian companies that have become more sophisticated, that have their own interests. And so it must be challenging for you in both exciting and intimidating ways to walk the path in between where, and I don't know, I mean, of course, academics have different opinions on this, but personally, mine has been that our work is connected to communities. We're at a public university, and so we are about democracy and how we can help communities in this country. And that doesn't necessarily line with the profit motives of big tech or of Indian tech. And so then the question is, how do you help the legal ecosystem, the legal order develop in ways that it supports people and it supports human flourishing? So I think that the central goal of what we do, it hasn't changed, but I think that the specific challenges that we're navigating, the questions we're responding to, those have changed.
Yeah, that's true. I think one of the first big questions you grappled with at CCG was the question of intermediary liability, and that took various shapes and forms, right? There was a report we were writing within the Indian context. There was this very interesting conference you ended up at Berkman Klein for, and comparative work came out of that. There was work we drew on to help inform the discourse in the lead up to Shreya Singhal. Could you tell us a little bit about what that experience was, of that like first big piece of work which saw many sort of different outputs in various shapes and forms?
I think that it also sort of ties in like the core of CCG, right, which is that it's research, and then there's teaching, which has two elements to it. One is that it just sort of draws people in. I met, by the way, your students not only from NLU Delhi but also from outside, so I'm very happy to see that that's growing. But then also like engagement. So we sort of help people process our work, but we also learn from them in the process. So our big one, as you were saying, was intermediary liability. We were, when Shreya Singhal was going on, a lot of the lawyers were generous enough to talk to people who were working in the space. And so we were part of debates kind of going into the case. We were also separately, so Berkman Klein Center at the end of 2012 was to set up this thing called the Global Network of Centers. And I think the generous people at CIS, specifically the research director, Dishant Shah, who had then continued to be my mentor for many years and still is, he hadn't met me then, but he knew that I was a new CIS fellow, so he recommended me to them, and I didn't know this. So I just received an email out of the blue from a professor, Urs Gasser, at Harvard Law School, and like I said, I was 27 or 28 at the time. And I had never been to the US when I got this email. So I looked into it and I thought it was a scam. I was convinced it was a phishing email. And so I went and Googled him and I was like, oh, actually, this is real. And then I went to the Vice Chancellor and I said, what do you think? And he said, you should go, obviously. I was like, but it's expensive. And he was like, well, this is what universities have funding for. Go to the meeting, make friends. And maybe you continue to work with these people. And boy, was he right. So we went and they were very interested in developments around the world. Soon after, they became very interested in intermediary liability. They were doing a huge project on the development of law around the world. And it was what we were engaged in also because it was such a big issue in India. And so we wrote the country report for them, which they were happy with, and it led to many years of collaboration, which I know that Jhalak continues. And as you're saying, that kind of, so when you do research, I think that the hard part is carving out time to do your academic output, and you should absolutely do it. I, towards the end, started developing a habit of getting up early in the morning and making sure that that writing gets done. But then you also do the reports, you figure out other places where this work can be helpful, and then it kind of becomes a body of work that translates into different forms, but it also grows because now you're engaging with people, you're learning, and the work is changing. So intermediary liability, I would say, was one of our first big projects, and I think kind of still continues, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a core part of our work even today at CCG. I mean, the contours and shape and form of intermediary liability is being very hotly debated in the lead up to the Digital India Act, and it remains to be seen what sort of version of intermediary liability we have in the years to come. But we released a report earlier this year on intermediary liability, and we drew heavily from the work that the pretty much the first team at CCG had put together and really built upon that. And I think it's so interesting that CCG actually was live covering the Shreya Singhal judgment, the Shreya Singhal proceedings from court. Back then, we didn't really have X and Twitter to do it, but we were doing it on the CCG blog.
Yeah, my younger colleagues were amazing. And this was completely their idea. This is the other thing about CCGs, is you don't think of everything. So what would happen is that my colleagues would go to court and watch the hearings, and they were like, hey, we should blog about these hearings. And so they started covering it, and this is before the live tweeting of cases happened. So people would read our blog to see what was happening with the Shreya Singhal case. So yeah, there were a lot of like little things that I sometimes even forget we started, so that was one. Then the internet shutdowns map was also, we were the first institution to do that because we were tracking it for Freedom House. And then one of my younger colleagues was like, well, maybe we should make a map of this. And so it's really amazing how these projects grow.
So what do you think civil society in India has been able to bring to the table over the last couple of decades? What have been the hits and misses, and where does CCG figure in all of this?
So, plenty, but I want to start by saying that to me it's very important that we don't think of ourselves as civil society. As you said, we are very much a part of the ecosystem. We engage in civil society, but I think that what we do that is valuable with all of its flaws and benefits is we bring expertise to the table. And so I think that maybe the net neutrality movement is a good illustration of this. If we had been classic civil society, we would probably have been engaged in the advocacy, and we were not at all. We were no part of it because that is not what we do. But as we were around and helpful and connected with the civil society players, and we, by the way, were very immersed at the time in privacy and other. And it was civil society that came to us saying that, look, this is a difficult question. Why are you not involved? It's a difficult investigation about privacy. And they said, yeah, but this is what the regulators are coping with. And eventually the regulators reached out to us. And since we were in a public university, we tended not to say no if the regulators specifically said, we'd like to know how to think about this. So come tell us what you think. So then we looked at the debate and we realized that while the advocacy is great, and everyone's doing a good job of illustrating what the problem is. What was missing was a path for Indian law to put net neutrality regulation in place. Because at the time, what was being proposed was common carriage, which is a legal principle that exists in American law, but not in Indian telecom. We have it in the old thoughts for like boat pathways and that kind of thing, which is where it was taken from, but never in Indian telecommunication law. So because we're a research center, we said, okay, what does Indian telecom law say? And read the telecom licenses and looked at the regulations for how the telecom licenses should be read, and they have to be read in consonance with the Constitution of India. And here's why CCG is important, not only within the Indian ecosystem, but I think in terms of the ideas in the world, right? Because the Indian Constitution, unlike the American Constitution, says that a plurality of ideas is important. So the right to access information and the right to access a diversity of information is a speech value within the Indian Constitution. And so if that's how you have to read telecom law, then you have a beautiful argument for net neutrality that is not anchored in tort law, which, as you know, is weaker than constitutional law. It is attached directly to the Constitution. It says that you have to have net neutrality because people have the right to access the plurality of information, and that is the argument we made. It is the argument that was eventually adopted by the regulator, and I think as a team, we found it very satisfying because it showed us that there is a special role that we play that is necessary and is a part of this ecosystem. So I think that civil society is really important because civil society is what made that issue salient. Without civil society, without the movement, no one would have cared. But I think that we were also important in a different way because someone needed to be there with the resources, with sort of the mandate for thinking this through a particular way to construct that argument.
Yeah, I think bringing the constitutional rights framework, bringing in a longer term approach and vision to research, rather than, very often, given the pace of policy and legislative documents the government is throwing at you, we tend to get lost in the noise, and it's hard to really step back and think, okay, how is all of this coming together? What is the art? Where are we headed as an ecosystem, as a sector? And I think spaces like CCG endeavor to not get so lost in the noise and perhaps create some space for our researchers to do a little more of that longer term thinking. Though it's a constant tension and tussle, highlighting that different perspective, but then you're getting slotted into that category and you're only asked questions in the room that have to do with those things, and you're not valued for your general expertise on the subject, where you also have a lot of very useful input and perspective to share. So I think that's one. And you've kind of been on both sides and you've seen it from both sides, so I think that brings an interesting perspective. And I think secondly, especially as a woman from the global majority, you tend to get pigeonholed, you sometimes. And what would be your advice to navigating such situations?
Okay, I might ask you a little bit about how you get pigeonholed as a woman, but I'll maybe do the first part. It's still an ongoing process, right? So I'm now publishing more in American journals, which, if you know American law reviews, they're run by American law students specifically. And so it's been interesting to me, and I really feel like I'm in the most nurturing possible institution for this, but mentally, you have your own ways of understanding things. And my way of understanding things is, I say that I am now learning to speak a different academic language. Because the way we talk to each other here, I mean, both like our day-to-day English, but also our academic language is very different from how you do it there. And so firstly, I think that once you figure out who to engage with, you have to invest a little bit of time in learning both the community and how to talk to them. And I've been very lucky in getting a lot of mentorship and generous support as I learn to do it. What are the little and big things that you can do to make what you're saying legible? So this is, I got asked such a great question once about my work, about what are your different audiences? And that's the thing, is that mine has different audiences. And the one that I find easy to connect with are my global majority audiences, because we've been having this conversation for a long time. But for me, it was also important. This is my like current phase of work. Is I'm also like, if I can get the global minority audiences to engage with why the theory of this is important, then maybe that leads to a change that I want to see in the world. But to come back to like, if you were going to international institutions, right, like how would you engage with them? Sometimes it's not you, it's them. But sometimes there are ways. Like you can find someone wonderful who wants to be supportive, like David Kay, who was UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. So David would do these consultations where he would make an effort to bring in different voices from the team. And in one of my early days, I think that I sort of also said that, look, I think we need to engage with like mainstream theory concerns, because sometimes, so especially in the early days, this entire conversation was so American dominated that you would have like a UN Special Rapporteurs meeting being discussed in terms of the First Amendment. So I remember getting really mad one meeting and saying that, but this is like the ICCPR, it is not the First Amendment. And David was wonderful, because what he would do is he would send his drafts out for consultations to a few people, and he chose to include me. I think sometimes it's also important to be assertive, but it really helped me. So I had used, in an essay for Berkman Klein, the term hyperlocal for hate speech. I'd said that hate speech is a hyperlocal problem, which is why platforms struggle to understand it. And then we had included that term also in the CCG submissions, but we had cited my article. So I noticed that in the report, hyperlocal had been used, but my essay hadn't been referenced. So I wrote to David and I said, do you think you could cite my essay, since I use the term hyperlocal in this Berkman Klein publication, and he did. And so I think that sometimes it's also trusting the people that are good and helping them engage with us in ways in which they want to. And it was great because then, we became friends, and David created this amazing community of researchers from the majority world, one of whom won the Nobel Prize. So it can be great when it works, is what I'm saying. I know that it's frustrating, but sometimes it's not. You work with Berkman Klein's Jess Field, who's one of the very, very supportive individuals in the minority field. And so you find your people, you build the relationships, and other people are like, hey, what came out of this is actually great, so maybe would you can we work together too? I think that especially now, there's a lot of interest in majority world voices, and one like yours that is powerful, but you've also seen how it works on the other side. I think that it's an opportunity to sort of open a door, and then start speaking in a different language, if that makes sense, or creating a shared language.
I think, people like David are the easier ones. I've worked a lot with him. He's the chair of the GNI board, which I'm an academic board representative on, and he's done a lot over the last several years to bring in a lot more global majority membership within the organization, and really driven those conversations. But I think there are many rooms, and I did feel this in the time that I spent in the US, which tends to dominate the development of the scholarship, and also tends to dominate the conversation, as you're rightly saying, in a lot of international rooms where the focus becomes so US-centric that they almost brush off, or they'll give you this space in a very functional manner to voice a perspective, but there isn't real interest and need for engagement. So it's a mixed bag, because I think there are incredible people like Sue from Berkman Klein, Jess from Berkman Klein, Martija at Stanford, and a bunch of people who are very interested in these issues. But I think you do hit the wall with a certain other set, and I guess it's just the way of the world. And perhaps there will be a shift that happens over a period of time.
I think there will be, because while it's frustrating, I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a wall so much as when we're all discussing questions, there are pressing things that we are very anxious about. And so we're so hyper-focused on them that if someone comes and says, well, there's this data access problem happening in this part of the world, we're like, yes, that's very important, but. And I think that's why this language thing works, because I want to acknowledge that it is frustrating and what you're describing happens, and that some conversations tend to dominate debates. But I think it's also possible to both through people that are supportive and by finding ways, if we're interested. I wouldn't say join conversations that you have no interest in, but if you feel that there's so my next paper is on AI, and it's a much delayed paper. But part of the challenge with it for me has been, how do I find a way to make what I'm saying interesting to the people who have a particular set of anxieties about AI? And so with my last essay, it was called Facebook Spaces. It was how do I show people that they should think about global social media platforms in a more expansive way than just the US or Europe. Once I figured out how to do it, and believe me, it took time. I could turn it over multiple times, discuss it with people, and they would be like, yes, but if you were just a person interested in platform issues and not necessarily interested specifically in other countries in the world, how would this be valuable to you? So then I had to be like, okay, this is going to teach you something about platform governance that you didn't know, whether or not you are interested in Myanmar. Ideally, you should be interested in Myanmar, but even if you're not, there are things to learn from watching it. So,
Yeah, I remember when you made the presentation at the Social Media Reboot Institute that the Berkman had just set up. There was so much excitement in the room, and you got a barrage of questions. So you're right, it's about perhaps taking the same issues we're trying to convey, but figuring out how they're useful to those audiences and engaging for those audiences.
And can I tell you one thing? Again, for everyone that gets discouraged, right? So the first time that I had workshopped a version of that, obviously not the final version, but the very initial question, I was told, why are you writing about the Facebook Oversight Board? You're you're so good at global South questions. You should write about that. This is weird and technical, and it was a peer workshop, but I could have been like, okay, all right, and I could have gone home, but I was like, no, I think it's amazing. So, and I think that maybe there are things to say about it.
I'm going to pause here and invite questions from the audience. Some of my colleagues will walk around with mics, and feel free to just raise your hand and and shoot some questions for Deepak.
Thanks. Yeah. So, I still remember Chinmayi, first time we met at one of the events at Taj Palace, and you had just joined as a scholar with CIS at one time, and in fact I was also surprised because I thought, again, it's a matter of bias, you can say, okay, I acknowledge that, that perhaps you were a student at that time. No, but then later I learned that you already done your master's by that time. And so it's good to see CCG at 10. In fact, as I was mentioning to a couple of students from the first batch of NLU, they had entered with me in 2011, in fact, before even CCG got started. And it's also great to see somebody like you working with Jonathan Zitran. I mean, I heard the word generative technology first time from him about 15 years back. I mean, this was for past 1 year, yes, everybody is talking about generative, but the very idea of generative. So my question to you is, where do you see CCG at 20?
That's a question for Jhalak. So, and I'll tell you why. I think part of institutions is that they should never be about individuals. And so I was always going to lead because this is not an institution until it stops being about me. And Jhalak has shaped CCG in ways that I could never have imagined. It has grown in beautiful directions. And so I think it is both a question for Jhalak And a question for others who may choose to shape CCG's path in the future. But I am going to throw it to you. What do you think?
I think some of the fundamentals will always stay the same, right? We were talking yesterday and you were like, the core of CCG when you started it was academic research, policy input, because there was so much interesting sort of stuff happening in India, opportunities to really engage and leverage that research to inform policy discourse and teaching, right? But I think as with every institution, the shape, form and modalities of those things evolve, right? Today I wouldn't call it teaching, I would call it capacity building. Because as you're saying, it's no longer just about NLU Delhi. It's about the broader ecosystem, and I'm not even saying the tech policy ecosystem, I'm saying just the broader ecosystem. How can we bring more marginalized, non-urban, elite law schools, elite engineering school voices into the discourse? Like, how can tech policy be truly an inclusively designed set of policies? When you have those perspectives sitting at the table, and we've realized that the funnel that's coming to us is a relatively homogeneous funnel, and the only way to fix that is actually go back and do that work and create those pathways and create those systems for those students to learn and engage with these things and feel enthused to come into this space. So I think a lot of the fundamentals of an organization stay the same, and I think you laid a very strong foundation. The bones were all there, but obviously as the ecosystem evolves, as the needs evolve, as the organization grows and has the capacity to do new things, we spot the opportunities and the challenges, and we try to address them in the best way possible.
And the students of today are going to be able to use generative AI like breathing, the way we did with Google search. And so in 10 years, I think we will have some of them sort of shaping how we engage with AI and technology in ways that we can't imagine right now. But as you say, like the values, the layers that you've built on the values, because now you've expanded the people that we will bring into our community of learning with us, that will stay.
Yeah, and I can't say what we'll be in 20 years. I don't know if I'll be here at CCG in 20 years. Hopefully not. Hopefully the next generation of leadership will be building a more robust and wonderful institution. But really, it's the people within who are shaping it in small and big ways. Obviously, there are younger folk in the team, there are, more experienced folk in the team, and everyone's voices come in different ways to shape it. And you look back at a year and you realize how the small conversations have shaped things in big ways. So it's really hard to envision what we'll be in 20 years. All I can say is I hope CCG is thriving and continuing to give back to the space and help shape public discourse and inform public discourse in a meaningful way.
You set it on a great path to do so. So fingers crossed, and thank you for doing that.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please go ahead.
Hi Chinmayi. So you spoke a little bit about having to adapt the way you discussed your work in the US, and how that was kind of whole process of translating the interests that you had for a different audience. So this is to zoom out on that. What were the things that kind of surprised you or disoriented you when you actually got there and started working in that environment? What kind of changes in the academic environment in particular did you not foresee, or which kind of left you feeling like, oh, I didn't expect this?
Thank you for asking. I don't think I had spent a lot of time thinking about it, the specific ways in which that environment would be different. I think in part also because I engaged with people that were so friendly and so kind, like the people that we discussed, that it had never occurred to me that I would kind of need to reorient. But I think that what is different but also special in a great way about American academia is that it's very theoretical. Maybe it's just because of the time at which people do the degree or the resources that the schools devote to theory and to research. But they're very, there's a really rich and deep theoretical conversation going on there that initially can be a little hard to get on top of, but you have to if you want to engage. And so I think initially I was saying things that to them probably sounded like platitudes, because it would be that I would say a thing that I thought was new because I thought of it, like, I don't know, like last month, and Julie Cohen would have written 2 books. Right? So, and by the way, almost always if you have a thought, it should occur to you that Julie Cohen has probably written 2 books on it, because she often has. So, so over time, you know, as I kind of immersed more and started reading that theory and learned who to follow, whose work to stay on top of, it became kind of easier for me to understand what I'm building on. And initially it was intimidating because earlier this year, I had spent a whole month thinking about risk and AI as a dimension of my paper. I was like, oh, this risk-based thinking deserves investigation. And I had gone to a conference and I was like, has anyone written about risk and AI? Is it insane to ask that question? And someone was like, your predecessor at the ISB, Marco Kaminsky, has just written a huge law review article investigating it in detail. And so your reaction to that initially can be, oh no. But actually your reaction to it should be, oh yes. Because somebody has thought this through. They have done this work that you consider important, and then you cite them and you build on their work and you become interesting. So that's been the change, and I really enjoyed it. It takes work to stay on top of, but that richness and attention to detail and it's almost like a very intentional way of thinking about your academic work. Where are you positioned in this ecosystem? Why are you taking this position as opposed to this one? What ideological leanings do you have, which of course are related to what values you hold? I really enjoyed investigating that. And the good thing, I mean, I don't know whether it's just Yale Law School and my mentors, the great thing has always been that every time I'm like, well, I feel like what I'm saying may be too controversial or too weird, they're all like, no, this is your voice, this is what you think. What we're going to help you with is making the argument in a way that is meaningful, credible, and communicates what you're trying to say. But what you want to say, that's you.
So we just have a few minutes before we wrap up. So maybe we'll just take a few questions together if we have some. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, Chinmayi. Good evening, Jhalak. It was really nice listening to you. I'm just curious about that one thing you mentioned about the narrative of tech policy back then. So I really want to know if you can give some more insights on how was the narrative back then, and how has that shaped over the years until now, and where do you see that narrative, you know, going ahead from into the future, and like who do you think would be really controlling it, and do you see it becoming a universally accepted truth or something, or will it still stay a narrative of the big tech?
And I'm going to add a question that we have on the Google Doc that we'd open to the audience, which I think fits in well with that, because she's talking a bit about the past. This question links towards the future. What do you think will be the biggest tech policy issues to come up in the next 2 years?
Big questions. Okay, let me see. I mean, of course, AI. It's hard to. Generative AI is just beginning to throw up this range of questions. It's interesting because it's everything from this. So I'm answering the second question as well. I'll say yours too. Everything from copyright to how is it going to affect society they've all come up again with generative AI. And so I think that is a truly exciting change that is going to affect how. I guess many of the questions that we work on, I hope that doesn't mean that we lose sight of the other things that are happening. But to your point, I mean, I'm just offering one perspective, right? Like Jhalak may have a different one. So you were at PRS and you were kind of watching these questions from a different point of view. So from where I was sitting, at least 2010 to about 2013, 15 or 16, was very civil liberties oriented, and I think I would be lying if I said that it was not shaped at least a bit by big tech. And this is retrospective, right? Because at the time we were all sitting in it, it was not so evident to us. And in some ways, the questions that they raised were important for us to think about, because intermediary liability was, we didn't necessarily need to agree with big tech exactly about how it was regulated. So for example, I've never been entirely easy about a libertarian. If you try to regulate child sex media or abuse of sexual media, that's a slippery slope. Like that's not, I don't find that a satisfying argument, and I never have. But that we have to think about intermediary liability differently in view of platforms, big tech had interest in it, but it was also a question of raised. Anyway, GDPR and all of it, what happened was that the European Union started pushing back on the big tech setting of the agenda, which was very important. Big tech did not like it. They told us so in detail, but it changed things. And I think that then it sort of split off into two, and I'd love to see your take on it, which is that I think that a very valuable socioeconomic rights discourse sort of started creeping into how tech policy was thought about. And I want to emphasize it because that is, scholars and activists did that work, and we should not erase it. And so the whole Aadhaar debate, parts of the net neutrality debates, these were all influenced a little bit by that, but also a little bit by entrepreneurs, because I'm sure that the other change of which we must have experienced more is that then Indian businesses were like, hey, we want a piece of this. And so now when I come back, which is only periodically, because I'm not really writing about India-centric questions anymore, I am seeing this huge influence of Indian tech in shaping the narrative. But maybe you could say more about that.
I think the big shift that I've seen in the last few years is the Indian tech perspective coming to the fore more, and the sort of tensions that are there between foreign big tech and Indian tech, and how those spill over into policy debates and conversations. I think the GDPR point you raised is very important, and the way I see big tech talking about it is, oh my God, our compliance costs have increased incredibly, which means that now we have to staff compliance teams more robustly, which means that we have less money to spend on making the platform safer and staffing our trust and safety teams. So it's almost like this binary that gets created, that if you're going to put all these requirements on us, from a compliance perspective, expect less from us on some of the other things that are equally, if not more important. And that's a worrying sort of perspective to hear, because I don't think that's the intentionality with which any of these laws are being brought forward. But I think it will take time for people to absorb what's coming in and settle in with it and see the value, perhaps.
Can I nerdily add a reading recommendation to this? So Ari Ezra Walden has this amazing book called The Industry Unbound, which talks about how big tech pretends to comply, but then sort of orients its compliance towards its own priorities.
Yeah. Last question for the crowd. All right, push us.
Thank you. So I think just continuing on that discussion about the India approach to tech policy, right? I think India has very strongly, globally, in a lot of platforms now gone ahead and said that India is going to take a pro-innovation approach when it comes to AI governance. And that's something that India is pushing for, not just in the domestic policy discourse, but also in the international forums as well. When I say India, I mean the Indian government. I just want to understand your take on that as we go about drafting the Digital India Act. What does a pro-innovation approach mean, especially for our domestic industries, and what we discussed just now in terms of compliance costs going up, right? Its impact on smaller tech startups in India.
Do you want to?
No, I think.
Okay. So one is that I'm not following it enough to know what they mean by a pro-regulation piece. And I think that part of that is key, right? Regulating towards what. If I can combine it with the previous question, I came here for another conference a little over a week ago. And it's interesting because most of the Indian speakers there were all industry. And at the dinners, the foreigners told me that all the Indians speaking there said, Indians are not concerned about risk, we are only interested in opportunity. And I was like, Indians are concerned about risk. They apparently are not speaking at this conference, but they are concerned about risk. And I think that is the key with regulation. So, you know what I said before about finding that one of my brilliant predecessors had written an article on AI and risk. Her name is Margot Kaminsky. It's a great article. I'm sorry I'm an academic, so I think of articles every time you ask a question, but genuinely, if you're interested in this and how regulation prioritizes different people, you should read the article, because part of the thing with AI regulation is that they're using risk frameworks, which is very different from harm frameworks. Because risk frameworks kind of construct risk. They're imagining what will be dangerous, who it will be dangerous to, and what should be higher priority. And I think that understanding that will probably help you understand the regulatory choices that are made. I say this without knowing what they're referring to specifically.
Thank you so much for a very interesting conversation, Chinmayi. It was, I think many of the stories you told us and the things you said are things I've heard from you over the last 15 years. But yeah, there were several things I learned for the first time as well. So it was definitely very interesting. We will now move towards the launch of our book, and then we have a great discussion lined up with Dr. Usha Ramanathan, which I'm very much looking forward to, and which will really, I think, maybe better answer a lot of the questions we were getting towards the end, because I think there's no better person than her to reflect on them. Thank you so much for being a very kind and engaged audience. And then I invite my colleagues to take us into the next part of this session.
Thank you for this, and thank you.